What caused the heart of Jesus to be angered and grieved? That's what we're talking about today on Byte-Size Theology. Hello and welcome to Byte-Size Theology. My name is Philip Nelson. We are continuing in Mark for our summer reading challenge of 2022. Today we are reading Mark chapter 3, and here we are looking at the anger and grief of Jesus. Mark 3 has 5 key segments. First, Jesus heals a man with the withered hand. Second, Jesus is followed by a large crowd from many places. Third, Jesus calls the 12 apostles. Fourth, Jesus is accused of being possessed by the prince of demons. And fifth, Jesus identifies those who are of his family. I'm going to be focusing especially on that first segment with regard to the man with the withered hand. Now, as we move from chapter 2 into chapter 3, we see the Sabbath saga continues. This time, Jesus enters a synagogue, and there was a man there with a withered hand. All Mark says in verse 2 is that they watched Jesus. Now, presumably, these are the Pharisees from chapter 2. Certainly, we know from verse 6 that Pharisees were there. Now, why were they watching Jesus? Was it to see if the power of God would be revealed? Was it to see if the scriptures would be fulfilled in Jesus, or if he was who he said he was? No, the purpose of their careful observation was to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. When reading verses 1 and 2, it almost seems like it was a setup. Now, Jesus openly confronts the hidden intentions of their heart. He does not shy away from the sticky situation. He calls the man with the withered hand to come front and center. Then, rather than speaking to the man, he speaks directly to those who sought to accuse him. He asks them this question: is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill? That's in verse 4 of chapter 3. Now, they were silent. They refused to answer. They could not. Look at verse 5. I always like to pay careful attention to places where our Lord's heart is revealed. Note his emotions. Chapter 3, verse 5. He looked around at them with anger and grieved at their hardness of heart. Their refusal to answer revealed that they had no care or concern for this man with the withered hand. Their hearts were hard, not only to the suffering of their neighbor, but also their hearts were hard to what Jesus was teaching them through this event. Further illustrating what he said in chapter 2, verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now I pause here to examine my own heart. Is my heart hard towards those who are suffering around me? Whether that be emotional, physical, spiritual, financial, etc. As we consider the witness of all 4 Gospels, it would be safe to say that Jesus cared not only for the object lesson with the Pharisees, but also for the man who was suffering. Furthermore, is my heart hard towards the things that Jesus is trying to teach me day in and day out? Ultimately through his word, but even as he uses circumstances or suffering or sermons, etc. Do not pass by these passages thinking that it could never apply to you. Now, returning to the passage, Jesus says to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Note, Jesus does not touch him. He just tells him to stretch out his hand. Neither Jesus nor the man did anything that would have broken the Sabbath. He simply spoke. And as the man obeyed, the healing occurred. But the irrefutable evidence before their very faces is that the man's hand was restored, and that at the command of Jesus. That was enough for them. Consider that their anger is evidence that they attributed this healing to Jesus. They had no problem recognizing the power of Jesus. Neither did the unclean spirits who professed him as the Son of God later in chapter 3, verse 11. Nor did the scribes who came from Jerusalem, who claimed that all of these powerful works being done by Jesus was because he was possessed by the prince of demons. Chapter 3, verse 22. The scribes and Pharisees did have a problem, rather, with what Jesus was claiming, that he was the Son of Man, the Son of God, the Lord of the Sabbath. And by healing the man on the Sabbath, he was not just claiming it, he was declaring it with this miracle. Now, what was the result of this miraculous work? Rejoicing that a handicapped man was restored? No. Verse 6 states that the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Jesus has a unique way of uniting people, some people to follow him and some united to destroy him. The Herodians now, they were a group of loosely organized people that sought to advance the political and economic influence of the Herodian family. Although the Herodians and the Pharisees were definitely adversaries in regard to many political and religious issues, they joined forces here to combat the perceived threat to their power and their status. Now, this note comes from the ESV Study Bible. Friend, if you do not have a study Bible, I highly recommend this resource. See the link in the description. Jesus was now facing religious and political enemies. As we read through the rest of the chapter, we see even that his family thought that he was out of his mind. Chapter 3, verse 21. We see these lines of distinction being drawn, and it will continue to become clearer and clearer as the chapters go on. But opposition is not the only thing that we see in chapter 3. We also see the crowds following him, the calling of the 12 apostles, and that interesting scene at the end of this chapter. While his family, who thought that he was out of his mind, was standing outside, the crowd gathered around Jesus and they called for him. The crowd informed him that his mother and his brothers were outside seeking him, and his response to them was this: "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Now, looking around at those who sat there with him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother." Who is Jesus' true family? Those who do the will of God. So, my friend, as you see the opposition that stands against Jesus in this passage and the opposition that stands against him and his followers today, what is your response? In today's day and age that celebrates as good that which God has called evil, see Isaiah 5:20, are we willing to be considered a brother, a sister of Jesus? Will we be those who do the will of God? Has Jesus become more precious to you than anything that this world has to offer? Now, we'll get more into those kind of thoughts tomorrow in tomorrow's reflections. So, have you read through Mark chapter 3 yet? What stood out to you from this chapter? Let me know in the comments below. Do you have any questions about this chapter? If you do have questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them, either in those comments or in an upcoming video. Now, I want to thank you so much for joining me today on Byte-Size Theology. Until next time, my friends, may the great and gracious God whom we serve grant you focused, faithful, and fruitful time in his word. We'll see you over in the next episode.